At 1:47 p.m., Lena Brooks heard her own name spoken behind a locked door. She had been carrying a silver coffee tray through the service corridor of Whitmore Manor, a 30-room estate overlooking the Hudson River, when the library voices stopped her cold. The winter storm outside pressed sleet against the tall windows, but the words inside were clearer than the weather. Victor Dane, the family advisor, said Lena would be blamed when the federal files appeared. Another man answered that Elias Whitmore would sign the refinancing package during Founders Night, believing it protected the company. Once his signature was secured, altered ledgers would make him responsible for years of hidden transfers, while the Whitmore Community Housing Trust would become collateral for a shell corporation. More than 600 families could lose their leases, and Elias would be removed before he understood what he had approved. Lena stood motionless beside the narrow wall panel used by servants for generations. She had worked at the manor for only 4 months, but she knew every hinge, stair, and drafty passage. She also knew Victor had personally approved her hiring, a fact that had once seemed like luck. Now it sounded like preparation. Through the panel, glasses touched the mahogany table. Victor calmly instructed the others to place a missing financial drive in Lena's locker after the gala. They would describe her as a resentful employee who had copied confidential records. Her father, Daniel Brooks, had once worked in Whitmore accounting, so the accusation would appear believable. Lena nearly dropped the tray. Her father had died 5 years earlier, insisting that one of his former employers had destroyed his reputation. He had never named the company. A floorboard creaked beneath her shoe. The library fell silent. Lena moved before fear could freeze her, carrying the tray toward the kitchen at an ordinary pace. At the corridor turn, she found Elias Whitmore standing beneath a brass wall lamp. He was 39, tall, white, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit, and known throughout the Hudson Valley as the controlled heir to a family empire with one foot in legal business and the other in old underworld loyalties. His gray eyes moved from the untouched coffee to Lena's tense face. He asked why she was serving a room that had not requested service. Lena answered that she had misunderstood the housekeeper's list. Elias studied her for one long second, then let her pass. In the kitchen, she set down the tray and opened the small notebook she used for pantry counts. She wrote every sentence she could remember, including a phrase Victor had repeated twice. Winter Harbor closes at midnight. Then she circled her own name, before she could decide whether to run, report the meeting, or pretend she had heard nothing. The service bell rang from Elias's private study. When Lena arrived, Elias closed the door and placed a blank sheet of paper on his desk. He said someone had entered the library corridor without authorization. Then he looked directly at her and asked what she had heard. Lena did not answer immediately. The study smelled of cedar, coffee, and the cold air slipping through old window frames. Elias remained behind his desk, not threatening her, but watching with the patience of a man accustomed to learning more from silence than from explanations. Lena understood that one careless sentence could place her inside the very story Victor intended to create. She said she had heard enough to know that Founders Night was not a celebration. Elias's expression changed only slightly, yet his fingers stopped moving beside the paper. She repeated the phrase "Winter Harbor closes at midnight." For the first time, he looked unsettled. He asked where she had heard it. Lena told him the truth about the service passage, the locked library, the refinancing package, and the plan to place a financial drive in her locker. She did not mention her father until Elias asked why Victor would choose her. When she said Daniel Brooks, Elias stood and walked to a cabinet near the fireplace. He removed an old personnel ledger and found the name within seconds. Daniel had been a senior accounts analyst 12 years earlier. The final notation said he had resigned after an internal ethics dispute. Lena recognized the handwriting beside the entry as Victor's. Elias closed the ledger and said accusations were not evidence. Lena answered that she was not asking him to believe her. She was asking him to verify one thing before the gala, whether the housing trust appeared anywhere in the refinancing package. The request was precise enough to break through his suspicion. Elias called Avery Quinn, an outside attorney whose firm was based 20 miles south in White Plains. He asked Avery to review the package without notifying the Whitmore finance office. After the call, Elias told Lena to return to her duties and speak to nobody. She asked whether that instruction was for her safety or his reputation. He admitted it was for both. By morning, the manor appeared unchanged. Staff polished silver. Florists measured the ballroom. And caterers discussed a dinner for 200 guests. Lena worked in the breakfast room while Victor spoke pleasantly with department heads. He never looked at her for long, which frightened her more than open suspicion would have. Near noon, the housekeeper informed Lena that her schedule had been moved to the west wing and that her locker would be replaced because of a broken hinge. Lena asked who had ordered the change. The housekeeper said Victor's assistant. Lena went to Elias before anyone could touch the locker. Together, accompanied by the housekeeper, they opened it. Nothing illegal was inside, but the back panel had been loosened. Elias photographed the screws and ordered the locker sealed. 2 hours later, Avery called. The housing trust was not named directly in the refinancing package, but a schedule of pledged assets referred to an unidentified residential portfolio with the exact value of the trust. Elias ended the call and turned toward Lena. His doubt had not disappeared, but it had changed direction. He asked what else she remembered. Lena opened her pantry notebook and placed it on his desk. Elias read the first page, then the second. At the bottom, beside Victor's words, Lena had written a question. Why hire the daughter of the man who first found the numbers? Elias looked up and said they were going to find out. Elias began with the only advantage Victor did not expect him to use: patience. He attended every scheduled meeting, approved routine expenses, and allowed preparations for Founders Night to continue. At the same time, Avery arranged a confidential review by a forensic accountant named Priya Shah, whose team worked from copies stored outside the Whitmore network. Lena remained in the West Wing, where she could observe the household without appearing close to Elias. Their conversations took place in ordinary moments, beside the linen inventory, near the greenhouse door, or while she replaced coffee in his study. Each time, Lena gave him details that seemed small until they formed a pattern. Victor's assistants collected signed delivery receipts even when no deliveries arrived. The finance office requested old staff schedules from the year Daniel Brooks resigned. A guest suite was being prepared for a records consultant who was not on the gala list. Elias checked each claim quietly and found support for all three. The first solid break came from a stack of catering invoices. Lena noticed that several pages used the current vendor logo, but an address the company had abandoned 3 years earlier. She had studied bookkeeping at a community college before family expenses forced her to pause, so she understood that copied templates often preserved outdated details. Elias sent photographs to Priya. The invoice numbers matched payments listed as security consulting fees, not catering expenses. The money had moved through a Delaware corporation called Winter Harbor Services. That evening, Elias asked Lena why she had never mentioned her accounting classes. She said the manor had hired a maid, not an investigator. He replied that titles often hid the most useful person in a room. Lena told him titles also taught powerful people whom they believed they could ignore. The remark stayed with him. Their alliance grew, but trust remained conditional. Elias gave Lena access to no confidential files and never asked her to search private offices. Lena refused to become a secret employee who could later be denied. She documented every observation, dated every page, and gave copies to Avery. The caution proved necessary when Victor invited Elias to the library and casually reported that a house employee had been asking about finance records. Elias asked for a name. Victor smiled and said he preferred not to accuse anyone without proof. The hypocrisy nearly exposed Elias's anger, but he controlled it and asked whether the refinancing documents were complete. Victor said they were flawless. Later, Priya reported that 3 electronic signatures had been copied from unrelated contracts and placed on approval forms created weeks afterward. The evidence suggested fraud, but it did not yet identify who controlled the scheme. Then the manor security system failed for exactly 18 minutes. During that gap, someone entered Elias's study and removed Lena's notebook from a locked drawer. Nothing else was taken. When Elias told her, Lena felt fear give way to certainty. Victor knew she had heard the meeting. Elias offered to send her to a hotel under another name. She refused because leaving suddenly would make the planned accusation easier. Instead, she asked to see the old service maps. In the basement archive, she found a narrow delivery shaft connecting the library to a sealed storage room. Inside the shaft rested a torn corner of cream paper bearing the embossed Whitmore crest. On it were 3 typed words: Brooks, Drive, Midnight. Someone had tried to destroy the meeting agenda, but one piece had escaped. The paper fragment was valuable because it proved planning, but Avery warned that it could still be dismissed as meaningless without the rest of the document. Elias ordered the storage room preserved and invited a document examiner to collect the fragment properly. By doing so, he changed the contest. Victor expected private retaliation, family intimidation, or a rushed confrontation. Instead, every new fact entered a documented chain that could survive outside the manor. Lena respected the discipline, although she did not yet know whether Elias wanted justice or merely control of his own empire. The next morning, that question became unavoidable. 2 county investigators arrived with a warrant concerning a stolen encrypted drive from Whitmore Logistics. Victor greeted them in the front hall and directed them toward the staff wing. Elias intercepted them and insisted that the house attorney and housekeeper accompany every search. The drive was found inside a cleaning supply cabinet assigned to Lena, wrapped in a cloth bearing her initials. Victor expressed carefully measured disappointment. Lena said nothing. She had never used that cabinet because the West Wing stored supplies on a different floor. Security footage should have confirmed the fact, but the previous night's 18-minute failure included the hallway outside the cabinet. Victor had built a tidy accusation. Elias could have protected the family company by dismissing Lena and letting the investigators take her statement elsewhere. Instead, he gave them the photographs of her loosened locker, Avery's timeline, and the evidence that Victor's assistant had changed her work assignment. He also disclosed the suspicious refinancing review. The investigators did not clear Lena immediately, but they agreed the drive could not be treated as isolated evidence. Victor's expression remained polite as the officers left, yet the mask around his eyes tightened. That afternoon, he asked Lena to bring tea to the sunroom. When she arrived, he spoke as though offering career advice. He said large families survived by deciding which truths mattered and which truths merely created casualties. Lena answered that documented truth did not require permission from a family. Victor reminded her that her father had once believed the same thing. Before Lena could respond, Elias entered. He did not accuse Victor. He simply took the tea tray from Lena and told her Avery was waiting in the study. The gesture was ordinary, but its meaning was public. She was not isolated. In the study, the document examiner matched the paper fragment to a stack of agenda sheets found in the library printer. Printer memory showed the complete page had included 4 tasks: secure Elias's signature, transfer the housing trust, place the drive, and release the Brooks narrative. The final phrase referred to a prepared media statement describing Lena as the daughter of a disgraced accountant seeking revenge. Priya then uncovered another layer. Winter Harbor Services had paid a private research firm to collect Lena's employment history before Victor approved her application. She had not wandered into the conspiracy. She had been selected for it. Elias apologized for bringing her into his house without understanding why she had been chosen. Lena answered that an apology mattered only if it changed what happened next. Elias placed the unsigned refinancing package in a locked evidence case and said Founders Night would continue. Victor needed to believe the plan was still alive. Lena looked toward the ballroom where workers were hanging crystal lights. The gala was 3 days away, and now both sides knew the other was watching. 2 days before Founders Night, Priya found Daniel Brooks inside the numbers. His name did not appear on the fraudulent transfers, but his employee identification code had been used to flag 3 payments for review 12 years earlier. The flags were removed by Victor within 24 hours, and Daniel was dismissed soon afterward for alleged misconduct. A scanned memorandum stated that Daniel had altered records, yet the document metadata showed it had been created 6 months after his departure. Lena read the report twice before speaking. For years, her father had lived beneath an accusation he could not disprove. He had moved the family from apartment to apartment, accepted temporary bookkeeping work, and warned Lena never to trust a company that investigated itself. Elias listened without defending the Whitmore name. He admitted that his late father had signed Daniel's dismissal, probably without examining the case. Lena asked whether ignorance made the damage smaller. Elias said it did not. The answer did not repair the past, but it was the first time she heard a Whitmore accept responsibility without bargaining. Priya's discovery also revealed the full purpose of the refinancing package. Victor and 3 silent partners planned to move the housing trust into Winter Harbor Services. borrow against the properties, and create an artificial default. A court-appointed restructuring process would then remove Elias from operational control while Victor's group purchased the assets through another company. The plan depended upon Elias's signature, Lena's public disgrace, and Daniel's old case being revived as proof of a family vendetta. It was elegant on paper because each lie supported the next. Avery recommended canceling the gala and reporting everything immediately. Elias disagreed. Canceling would protect the trust temporarily, but Victor's partners could destroy evidence and shift the scheme elsewhere. Priya proposed a lawful alternative: allow the scheduled board presentation to begin, preserve the digital activity in real time, and place independent counsel, auditors, and a representative of the housing trust in the room. Elias would not sign anything. The board would hear the accusation and the answer together. Lena insisted on one condition. She would not enter the room dressed as a maid carrying coffee while powerful men discussed using her life as evidence. If she testified, she would do so as Daniel Brooks's daughter and as the person who discovered the conspiracy. Elias agreed immediately. He arranged for Avery to formally retain Lena as a fact witness and research assistant, which gave her access to counsel and protected her notes. That evening, Lena returned her uniform to the housekeeper and explained that she was taking temporary leave from domestic duties. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, surprised her by producing a sealed envelope Daniel had left at the manor years earlier. He had asked that it be given to Lena only if the Whitmore accounts were ever reopened. Inside was a handwritten list of payment codes and one sentence: "The truth is never in the largest number. It is in the number someone repeats." Lena compared the list to Priya's files. One payment code appeared every December for 12 years. It led not to Winter Harbor, but to a legal defense fund controlled by Elias's aunt, Nora Whitmore, the chair of the family board. Victor was not the only person who had known. Nora Whitmore arrived at the manor before dawn, wearing a camel coat and the composed expression of a woman who had spent 40 years protecting a family name. Elias met her in the breakfast room with Avery, Priya, and Lena present. Nora objected to discussing private matters before an employee. Lena calmly said she was not attending as an employee. Elias placed Daniel's payment list and the recurring defense fund transfers on the table. Nora's confidence weakened. She admitted that Daniel had come to her 12 years earlier with concerns about Victor's shell companies. She had authorized payments to outside counsel, but abandoned the inquiry when Elias's father threatened to divide the company and expose old criminal associations. Nora told herself she was protecting thousands of workers from collapse. Instead, her silence allowed Victor to become indispensable. Lena asked whether Nora had ever tried to clear Daniel's name. Nora said no. Lena replied that silence had been a decision, not an absence of one. Elias did not rescue his aunt from the judgment. He asked her to sign a sworn statement and surrender control of the defense fund records. Nora hesitated until Elias said he would disclose the records with or without her cooperation. She signed. Afterward, Elias and Lena stood alone in the glass conservatory while snow covered the garden. He told her that the Whitmore organization had been built through fear, favors, and debts that passed from one generation to the next. Since inheriting leadership, he had moved most operations into legitimate shipping, property management, and security services. But he had preserved the family's private structure because he believed control was safer than change. Victor had used that structure against him. Lena said systems built to keep outsiders powerless eventually made insiders blind. Elias asked whether she believed he was different from the people who came before him. She answered that difference was not a belief, it was a record of choices. He accepted the standard. Their closeness grew in the quiet that followed. Not as sudden romance, but as mutual recognition. Elias admired that Lena never softened the truth to make him comfortable. Lena saw that he could hear criticism without turning it into punishment. Still, she made clear that gratitude, protection, and affection could not erase the imbalance between them. Elias said he understood. He would prove it by what he surrendered, not by what he offered her. Final preparations for Founders' Night became an exercise in controlled transparency. Avery invited independent board counsel. Priya mirrored the presentation network to a secure server. Mrs. Bell documented staff access to every room. The county investigators agreed to observe from an adjacent office rather than interrupt the gala. Lena rehearsed only facts she had personally witnessed. She would not speculate about motives. On the afternoon of the event, Victor approached Elias beside the grand staircase and asked whether the signature page was ready. Elias said it would be handled at midnight. Exactly as planned. Victor smiled, believing he had won. Across the hall, Lena wore a tailored navy suit and carried Daniel's original envelope in a plain evidence folder. When Victor noticed her, his smile vanished for half a second. The ballroom doors opened, and 200 guests entered beneath the crystal chandeliers. The final meeting was no longer hidden behind a locked library door. Founders' Night began with music, speeches, and the careful performance of family stability. Local business leaders praised Whitmore Logistics for expanding jobs along the Hudson. Residents from the Housing Trust thanked the company for preserving affordable leases. Victor moved through the ballroom with effortless confidence, introducing bankers to board members and reminding everyone that the refinancing package would secure the next generation. Elias remained controlled at the head table. Lena sat beside Avery near the side of the room, visible but not displayed. At 11:30 p.m., the board and invited advisors moved into the library for the formal vote. Independent counsel, Priya, Nora, and a representative elected by housing residents were already seated. Victor noticed the additional attendees but continued. He presented charts showing debt exposure, market pressure, and the need to consolidate assets under a single emergency structure. The final slide identified Winter Harbor Services as an outside stabilization partner. Elias asked who owned it. Victor answered that ownership was protected by a confidential investment agreement. Priya requested permission to display verified corporate records. The board chair granted it after Nora recused herself. The screen changed. Winter Harbor's ownership chain led through 3 companies to Victor and his silent partners. Victor objected that the records were incomplete. Avery then introduced the copied signatures, altered invoices, printer history, and metadata from Daniel's false disciplinary memorandum. Each item came from an independent source and carried a documented chain of custody. Victor shifted his strategy. He said Lena had manufactured the entire story to avenge her father. Elias looked toward her, and the room followed. Lena stood without hurry. She described the night she carried coffee through the service corridor, the exact time she heard the meeting, the phrase about midnight, and the plan to place the drive. She admitted what she could not see and refused to claim what she could not prove. Then Mrs. Bell presented the staff schedule showing Lena had never been assigned to the cabinet where the drive appeared. Security technicians showed that Victor's assistant had used an administrator code during the 18-minute outage. County investigators entered only after the board counsel confirmed the information matched records obtained through lawful process. No one raised a voice. The pressure came from facts that could not be intimidated. Victor made one final appeal to Elias. He said the family would lose everything if private history became public. Elias answered that anything preserved by framing an innocent woman and endangering 600 families was already lost. Midnight arrived. The unsigned refinancing package remained in its evidence case. Elias formally withdrew it, suspended Victor from all company roles, and asked the independent board to place Whitmore Logistics under temporary external oversight. He also announced that the housing trust would be transferred into a permanent nonprofit structure whose board included residents and employee representatives. Victor stared at Lena as though she had taken something from him. Lena understood the truth was simpler. He had built a plan that required everyone else to remain silent. And silence had finally ended. As the investigators escorted Victor to a private interview room, the ballroom clock finished striking 12. Elias did not celebrate. He looked at Lena and said her father should have been heard the first time. Lena answered that what mattered now was whether the people in power would listen the next time before a servant had to stand behind a wall. The morning after the gala, Whitmore Manor looked less like a fortress and more like a building after a storm. Guests were gone. Flowers leaned inside half-empty vases, and staff moved quietly through rooms where every secret now seemed temporary. External auditors sealed the finance office. Independent directors interviewed department heads. Victor's partners resigned before noon, but their records had already been preserved through bank notices and court orders arranged by counsel. Lena spent the day with Avery reviewing her statement. She corrected small details, separated memory from inference, and refused suggestions that made her role sound more dramatic than it had been. She had overheard a meeting. recognized inconsistencies, and continued asking questions. The evidence had done the rest. Elias faced a different task. He met employees in the ballroom and disclosed that the company had allowed hidden governance and family loyalty to override accountability. He did not blame Victor alone. He acknowledged that his own secrecy had created the environment in which the conspiracy could grow. He announced an independent ethics office, elected employee seats on the board, and a review of every disciplinary case connected to Victor. Daniel Brooks's record would be formally corrected, with compensation paid to his estate. Lena accepted the correction but asked that the money support a scholarship for workers studying accounting, law, or public administration. Elias agreed without attaching the Whitmore name. Nora resigned as board chair and submitted her sworn statement. Before leaving, she apologized to Lena. Lena said she accepted the truth of the apology, but forgiveness would take its own time. Nora nodded, perhaps understanding for the first time that remorse did not control the injured person's schedule. Weeks passed. No sudden transformation made Elias innocent of the system he had inherited and maintained. He cooperated with regulators, closed the family's remaining private enforcement operations, and sold assets that could not withstand public review. Some relatives called him weak. Others disappeared from the company rather than disclose their arrangements. Whitmore Logistics became smaller, but its legitimate divisions remained stable. The housing trust transferred safely to its new nonprofit board. Lena continued working with Avery and Priya, then enrolled in evening classes to finish her accounting degree. Elias offered to pay her tuition from personal funds. She declined and applied for the Daniel Brooks scholarship instead, following the same rules as every applicant. She won the award through an independent committee. Their relationship developed slowly, outside the language of rescue. They met for coffee in public places, argued about governance, and learned the ordinary details that secrecy had kept hidden. Elias discovered Lena loved old jazz records and disliked expensive restaurants with tiny portions. Lena learned he repaired antique clocks when he could not sleep and had never chosen a home without considering how quickly he could leave it. One evening, he asked whether she regretted staying after the meeting. Lena said she regretted that fear had been necessary, but not that she had trusted her own memory. Elias said trusting her had changed his life. She reminded him that changing his life was his responsibility. He smiled and agreed. The old dynamic between boss and maid had ended. Whatever came next would have to begin without it. 1 year later, the first snow of December fell across the Hudson as people entered the former Whitmore Manor through doors that had once been reserved for family guests. The estate was now the Brooks Center for Ethical Leadership and Workforce Education, governed by a nonprofit board that included housing residents, employees, teachers, and community advocates. The library where Lena had overheard the conspiracy had become a public records classroom. The service corridor had been preserved behind glass, not as a romantic secret passage, but as a reminder of how architecture could separate those who decided from those expected only to serve. Lena arrived early for the center's opening session. At 30, she had completed her accounting degree and joined Avery's firm as a forensic compliance associate. She wore a navy suit, her curly hair gathered in a low bun, and carried no tray. Her first workshop taught hotel workers, caregivers, and office assistants how to document financial concerns without placing themselves at unnecessary risk. Elias arranged folding chairs near the front entrance. He no longer used the title that had once defined him. Under external oversight, he served as chief operating officer of the legitimate shipping company and reported to an independent board. The old underworld network had dissolved into investigations, settlements, and lawful closures. He had lost influence among families that valued silence. But he had gained something he had never possessed, a life that did not require everyone around him to be afraid. During the dedication, Lena spoke about Daniel without turning him into a symbol polished clean by grief. She described a careful accountant who made mistakes, loved his family, and refused to accept numbers that could not be explained. His restored record now appeared in the center archive beside the evidence that cleared his name. Elias spoke next and said institutions did not become ethical because powerful people promised to improve. They became ethical when power could be questioned, recorded, and replaced. After the guests moved toward the classrooms, he found Lena beside the tall library windows. He asked whether she had seen the final plaque near the service corridor. She said she had approved the wording herself. Elias then asked whether she would have dinner with him after the first board meeting of the new year. Lena considered him with the same steady expression that had once forced him to examine an unsigned contract. She said yes, provided he chose a place with real portions and no private dining room. He agreed. Their affection had survived because it had never been used to erase accountability. It was not a reward for exposing Victor, and Elias was not a prize for enduring the manor. They had chosen each other only after the roles that placed one above the other were gone. Outside, families from the housing trust gathered for photographs beneath the snow. Mrs. Bell led a tour through the new classrooms. Priya argued cheerfully with a professor about audit software. The mansion no longer whispered around closed doors. Its most important rooms were open. Its records belonged to the public trust. And the woman once selected to carry blame now taught others how to protect the truth. Lena looked toward the corridor where everything had begun. At 11:47 p.m. 1 year earlier, she had heard her name used as part of a lie. Now it was written above the entrance to a place built so that the next person would not have to listen from behind a wall.